Here we are with T.S. Eliot. And with T.S. Eliot, we can safely say we are about 180 degrees from where we started this semester with William Blake. Remember, the Romantics, where we're all about the very personal, the confessional, the expressive, right? Everything was about the poet and the poet's feelings and trying to reproduce that. I mean, that was, of course, Wordsworth in particular. In T.S. Eliot, the writings of T.S. Eliot, we go so far away from that. He is the exact opposite. He removes personal feelings. Not that there aren't feelings in the poetry. That's not to say that whatsoever. But it is coded. It is using lots of references and allusions. It's hard in many ways to imagine reading T.S. Eliot without footnotes. Indeed, Eliot supplied the first footnotes for his own poems. Right? This was not poetry written for the common person. This is poetry that is very elitist in certain ways, unapologetically elitist, to be blunt about it. Right? Although we do need footnotes, so maybe there's an apology there. T.S. Eliot is looking at the condition of life in the early 20th century, and particularly the spiritual life that people are living or not living, right? In keeping in mind that Eliot is looking at really, in my opinion, a strong sense of loss, especially in the wasteland, but also to an extent in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Now, we have just these two poems. There's plenty to think about for T.S. Eliot. Right? Obviously, there's other great poetry that he's written, but we'll just kind of keep it to this. When we look at the love song, right, of J. Alfred Prufrock, it begins, of course, with Dante. Right, so already we're going a little elitist, and not too many shepherds reading Dante. Okay. The idea of this hidden life. And notice in T.S. Eliot, in Prufrock I'm specifically addressing here, right? There's a certain almost vicious irony where the word love song is used in the title. And where do you see love in here? Is it truly a love song? What kind of love song would you say that it is? When I think of T.S. Eliot, I kind of think of a lot of frustration. Prufrock in particular is in many ways about impotence, and I don't mean sexual impotence, but I mean lack of power, lack of ability to do something meaningful. Right? There's a paralysis about Prufrock. Now, the poem is very fragmented, right? It lacks transitions or easy transitions, okay? And indeed, that gets even more so in the wasteland, of course, right? It has allusions, and especially to Hamlet. Right? You need to know your Shakespeare if you really want to know Prufrock. Okay. Famous line: in the room, the women come and go. Talking of Michelangelo, right? What's that about? It's a repeated line, or two lines, I should say, couplet. There's the fog, which is like a cat. Now, fog, of course, is confusion, right? When we're in a fog, right, we don't know what's going on. But this is a yellow fog, which suggests something more polluted, like smog, but heavy and thick, right? And while a cat, for many of us, a cat is a pleasant figure, right? People like house cats. There's something about it that's kind of eerie as well, right? This yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, right? Again, you got the cat thing, which is nice, the fog thing, which is not so nice, the yellow thing is kind of sickness, illness, pollution, right, not so great. And the issue of time, there will be time. Okay, as I sit here and make this video as a slightly older person than I used to be back in the day, one thing I can tell you is there's not always time. Time is not limitless for the human. Right? We have an end point. There's a phrase I've heard repeated, and I use myself many times: the days are long and the years are short. You work and you work and you work and you work and you work, and all of a sudden, boom, you're old. You're 29. No joke. Is there time, though? Time is passing for Prufrock. You notice his attention to his physical body and how he sees himself getting older. He's losing his hair, for example. Okay? That's the time. There's also what I would call the observations of the celibate. As he looks at women, this character Prufrock looks at women, he sees them in disembodied parts. He doesn't tend to see women as complete, whole human beings. And yet at the same time, he also sees himself as being picked on, right? Picked apart, criticized. Notice the lines, eyes that fix you in a formulated phrase, and when I am formulated, sprawling on a pin, when I am pinned and wriggling on the wall. He is like an insect in a collection, right? Where you take a needle and you jab it through the insect, and then you put that insect still alive on your board or wall or table or whatever it is that you're putting together with a collection of insects. This is how he sees himself. A little self-esteem issue, right? Now, I don't want to go too much away, right? Because, reading Eliot is a process of discovery, and I don't want to prescribe to you particulars, right? Because there's so much that we can get out of it. But I'm going to leave you with one other last thought, and then we'll shift over to the wasteland, and that is the thought of Polonius. Polonius is a character in Hamlet. He is the father of Laertes and Ophelia. He is a advisor to the king, the uncle to Hamlet. If you're not familiar with the story, you should be. You need to read it. You need to watch it. Right? Polonius is also the first to die, if you don't count Hamlet's father, who died before the action begins. But in the play, Polonius is the first to die. And indeed, his death is totally unnecessary. Insignificant, in fact, as it turns out. Except, of course, to his son and daughter. The fact that Prufrock sees himself more in line with Polonius than Hamlet, right? That is very interesting. No, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. I'm an attendant lord. Right? Those lines there describe Polonius very, very well. Now, shifting over to the wasteland, it's a much bigger, longer poem, and therefore I can only say less about it because it's on you to discover it more. I would advise you, first of all, to read the poem alongside T.S. Eliot himself. We have a recording on Canvas of T.S. Eliot reading The Wasteland, And I would really, 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 the best advice I can give you, play that video, play that tape recording, obviously, play the recording while you read the poem. Do not read the footnotes on the first reading. Okay, do not stop and look everything up. The first reading, read it through with T.S. Eliot, because it is written in about 5 different languages, so that's helpful. And then go back and read more. Okay? Then you can start reading the footnotes. And once you get into the footnotes, right, you can get involved in all kinds of references and allusions. It's like tons and tons and tons, right? That's why there are so many footnotes. But I do just want to speak about the Fisher King. Okay? The myth of the Fisher King, the story of the Fisher King, is basically a story of what we might call the vegetable god. It is a god that dies, goes down to the underworld, maybe for 3 months, maybe for 3 days, and comes back up to life in the spring. It's a story of renewal, right? Of death and rebirth, winter and then spring. But in the conceit of the wasteland, the Fisher King has not been reborn. There is no renewal. There is no spring. April is the cruelest month. Why is it so cruel? Because that's when spring is supposed to happen. That's when the rebirth occurs, right? And as you read through, you'll find, of course, that there is essentially a famine, drought. Nothing is living. Nothing is reborn. I should say nothing is living. Things are alive, but nothing is being reborn. And it's not just a literal sense. In fact, it's not really a literal sense at all. It's a metaphorical sense of spiritual renewal, or the lack thereof. The spiritual renewal of the Western culture, which has lost its faith. A Western culture that has lost its spirituality. Okay? It is, in T.S. Eliot's mind, characterized by sterility, the inability to create something new. Okay? The inability to give new life. There are failures all throughout. Failure of love. Failures of people to respond appropriately. The wasteland is about decline and loss and failure. It is very fragmented, as I said. He calls it that, right? He calls them fragments, right? And you can take a look at bits and pieces here and there in the poem and say, okay, in this section, what's happening? Right? In that section, what's happening? I will tell you this. I've been teaching The Wasteland for many years, practically since it was published. No, not quite that long. Every time I read this poem, something new comes to me. Something new strikes me. That is certainly one measure, I would argue, of greatness in a piece of literature. Okay? So read this poem once with T.S. Eliot in your ear, then read it again as many times as you like. Read the footnotes, read them all. Read additional materials about it. I don't care who talks to you, what you read. Every time you read this poem, I can practically guarantee something new will stand out to you. Something new will grab you. I will finish with this. I had a student once who talked about the sound of T.S. Eliot, that he had a great ear for people's conversation, how people talked. All right. Listen to this poem. It is a poem that rewards rereading and listening.